The town of Harlan's Bend, Montana, did not have a doctor in the winter of 1884. It had a barber who knew how to set a broken bone if you did not mind the screaming, and it had a woman named Clara Whitfield, who had learned enough from her physician father before he died to be trusted with a fever or a wound that needed stitching. It also had, as of the second week of November, a problem. The problem arrived on the eastbound stage with no luggage to speak of and a left arm that had been set badly at some point in the past and healed crooked. She was perhaps 28 years old, though she looked older in the way that women who have worked hard and slept little tend to look older than they are. She gave her name to the station manager as Nora Alcott. She paid for one night at the boarding house run by Mabel Gentry, which was the only boarding house in Harlan's Bend, and she ate the supper that was included in the price without speaking to anyone at the table, and she went to bed. That would have been the end of it, except that she did not leave the next morning. Mabel Gentry, who had been running the boarding house for 14 years and had a finely calibrated sense of which guests were passing through and which were not, watched Nora Alcott sit in the small chair by the front window for the better part of a Thursday morning and said nothing about it. She brought coffee at 9 o'clock without being asked. Nora took it with both hands, the crooked left arm doing its necessary work, and said, "Thank you." And that was all. By noon, it was clear the woman was not going anywhere in particular. By supper time, it was equally clear she had nowhere to go. Mabel Gentry had seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize it. The town of Harlan's Bend had a complicated relationship with people who arrived and stayed without explanation. There was always speculation, which was the particular occupation of small places with long winters, and the speculation about Nora Alcott ran in the usual directions. Widow? Most people decided. Running from something, a few decided. Neither of these was wrong, exactly, though neither was the whole story. What most people did not know, because Nora Alcott did not say, was that she had been a school teacher in a town called Millhaven, 200 miles west, for 4 years. That the school board in Millhaven had let her go in October on the grounds that a woman her age who remained unmarried was, in their considered estimation, a questionable influence on the children. That she had spent the weeks between October and November working through what little she had saved with the methodical practicality of a person making a plan. And that the plan had landed her here, on a stage she had picked partly because the fare was affordable, and partly because she had never heard of Harlan's Bend, and that had seemed like sufficient reason. She had not cried about any of it. This was not because she was not hurt. It was because she had learned at some point in the years between 20 and 28 that crying required an audience of at least one person who would be affected by the sight of it, and she did not currently have that audience. It was Mabel who solved the problem of Nora's board before Nora had worked up to asking about it. She came to the front room on the Friday morning and said without preamble, "I have more work than I can manage alone, and my last girl left in September to get married in Billings. If you're not going anywhere specific, I could use the help." Nora looked at her. "I can cook," she said. "I'm not as useful with the laundry." She held up the left arm briefly by way of explanation. "I didn't ask about the laundry," Mabel said. "All right," Nora said. That was the arrangement. It was not charity, which was important to Nora, who would have refused charity on grounds that she could not entirely explain, but that had something to do with the difference between needing help and being incapable of providing something in return. She provided something in return. She cooked, which she did well, her father having been a man who believed that useful skills were not divided by gender. She managed the front desk in the evenings. She kept the accounts which Mabel, who was good at people and less good at numbers, was openly relieved to hand off. She did not, in those first weeks, talk much about herself. Neither did she pretend to be something other than what she was. When the men at the supper table asked where she'd come from, she said Millhaven. When they asked what had brought her to Harlan's Bend, she said she'd needed a change of scenery. This was true, as far as it went. The person who learned more than that, and not because he pushed for it, was James Aldridge. James Aldridge was 51 years old, which is not old in absolute terms, but which can feel old when a man has spent 30 years working livestock in Montana winters and has done it without anyone to come home to for the last 9 of them. He ran a modest cattle operation 6 miles outside Harlan's Bend, which he had built from a smaller operation over the course of a decade through the application of consistent work, and the kind of stubbornness that looks like patience from the outside. He came into town on Fridays for supplies and ate supper at Mabel's boarding house because the alternative was eating his own cooking, which he was honest enough to recognize as a grim alternative. He was not a large man or a dramatic one. He had gray in his beard and a habit of listening more than he talked, which is either a virtue or a limitation depending on the situation. He had been married once to a woman named Ruth, who had died of typhoid in 1875 along with their son, who had been 3 years old and had just learned to say his father's name with the specific 2-syllable confidence of a child who has recently mastered something important. James had stayed on the ranch because he did not know what else to do with himself, and after a while, staying on the ranch stopped being a decision and became a fact. He noticed Nora Alcott the first Friday she was at Mabel's, because she brought the food out herself instead of the girl he'd expected, and because she set his plate down with the efficient lack of ceremony of someone who has been doing useful work for long enough that the work itself has become invisible to them. She did not make conversation. He did not require it. He ate his supper and paid and left. The second Friday, she brought coffee without being asked because she had noticed the previous week that he sat with an empty cup for 10 minutes before the previous girl had come back through. He looked at the coffee and then at her. "Thank you," he said. "You were waiting for it," she said, and went back to the kitchen. It was a small thing. But James Aldridge, who was a man who noticed small things because the large things in his life had mostly gone the way of permanence and loss, thought about it on the ride home. The winter in Harlan's Bend that year was the kind that asserts itself early and without apology. By the first week of December, the roads out of town were difficult, and by the third week they were something a person didn't attempt without cause. The boarding house became, as it did every winter, a place where people spent more time than they otherwise would because it was warm and because Nora's cooking gave them a reason to be there that they could state out loud. It was during one of these evenings, a Thursday in December, that Nora and James ended up in the same room after the other guests had gone up to bed, Nora banking the fire for the night and James having missed the point at which he should have headed back to the ranch before the temperature dropped further. "You should stay," Nora said, not looking at him, working the fire with the efficiency she brought to everything. "It'll be 15 below by midnight." "I've ridden in 15 below before," James said. "I know you have," she said. "Mabel has a room." He stayed. They sat by the fire for an hour with the particular ease of two people who have been in the same room enough times to have stopped performing for each other. He told her about the ranch, not dramatically, just the way a person talks about the work that structures their days. She told him about the school in Millhaven, the 4 years of it, the children who had been impossible, and the ones who had made the impossible ones worth it. "Why did you leave?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "They asked me to," she said. He did not ask for more than that. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she gave it anyway. The school board, the stated reasons, the October that had unmade 4 years of careful work. She told it factually, without self-pity, which was something she had in common with people who have processed a loss long enough to be able to describe it without falling into it. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "That's not right," he said. "It was a simple statement, not a speech." "No," she said, "it's not." "You were good at it," he said, "the teaching." "I was very good at it," she said, which was not vanity but accuracy, and which she said with the directness of a woman who has reached the age of 28 without the luxury of false modesty. That was the part that was hardest to leave. He understood this. He had things he was good at, and the thought of being separated from them by the judgment of someone else's arbitrary standard was the specific kind of injury he could follow to its source. "What will you do?" he said. "I'm doing it," she said. He looked at her. The firelight did what firelight does, softened the edges, revealed the bone structure beneath. She was not a beautiful woman in the way that got you talked about. She was the other kind, the kind that takes longer to see and then cannot be unseen. He went back to the ranch the next morning. But the following Friday, he stayed for conversation after supper, and the Friday after that, and it became a thing that the other regular guests at Mabel's boarding house noticed and noted and did not comment on directly, which in a small Montana town is its own form of commentary. The trouble came in February, as trouble in small towns often does, when there is nothing else to occupy the people who are inclined toward it. There was a woman in Harlan's Bend named Vera Whitmore, the wife of the general store owner, who had the particular combination of social standing and underoccupied intelligence that tends to make itself felt in a community. She had decided, based on information she had assembled from various sources she considered reliable, that Nora Alcott had not merely left Millhaven but had been removed from it for reasons more serious than the official story. She shared this conclusion with 3 women at the church auxiliary, which was functionally the same as posting it on a broadsheet. What Vera Whitmore actually knew was nothing specific. What she suspected was something. What she communicated was everything in the tone and the pauses between the words. James Aldridge heard about it from the blacksmith, who told it with the blunt discomfort of a man reporting information he wishes he did not have. James thanked him and rode back to the ranch and thought about it. The next Friday, he came to Mabel's earlier than usual. Nora was in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway. "I heard something," he said. She looked at him. She had the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular piece of news and is not surprised that it has finally arrived, only measuring what it means now that it has. From Vera Whitmore, she said. It was not a question. Yes. She set down what she was working on and looked at him directly, the way she did when something required her full attention. "What do you want to know?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I know what I know." She looked at him for a moment. "What do you know?" she said. He thought about it. "That you do good work," he said. "That you're honest. That you made 4 years of something worthwhile and someone took it from you for a reason that wouldn't hold up in a fair light." He paused. "That's enough." She looked at the kitchen floor for a moment. When she looked up, her expression had shifted in the small way that expressions shift when a person has been holding something tightly and a trusted hand has touched their arm. She did not cry. He would not have expected her to. "Thank you," she said. "I'm going to have a word with Margaret Holt," he said. Margaret Holt was on the church auxiliary and had the quiet authority of a woman who had been in Harlan's Bend for 30 years. She has more standing than Vera Whitmore and better sense. I'll let her know what I know. "You don't have to do that," Nora said. "I know I don't," he said. He did it anyway. He was not a man who made speeches, and what he said to Margaret Holt was brief, plain, and sufficient. Margaret Holt, who was 60 years old and had seen enough of what small talk could do to a person's life, took the information and applied it in the way of someone who knows exactly which word in which ear will do the necessary work. The matter quieted. Nora never asked him directly what he had said or to whom. If she had her suspicions, she kept them in the place where she kept things she had chosen to leave alone. Spring came late that year, the way Montana springs do, arriving by degrees rather than all at once, the snow pulling back from the south-facing hillsides first, then the fields going from white to gray to brown to the first uncertain green. James Aldridge's cattle operation required his full attention in the spring, which meant he was in town less frequently, and when he was, the conversations were shorter. Nora noticed the absence. She did not analyze it because she was not a woman who spent her energy on things she could not verify, but she noticed. It was on a Saturday in April, a clear day with the sky the specific blue that only appears in Montana once the cold finally releases its grip, that James came by the boarding house not on his usual Friday schedule, and not for supper. He asked Mabel if Nora was available. Mabel said she was in the kitchen, and her expression as she said it was the expression of someone who has been watching 2 people take a long time to arrive at an obvious destination. James found Nora at the kitchen table going over the week's accounts. She looked up. "I have something I want to say," he said. "All right," she said. She set down the pen and gave him her full attention, which was one of her consistent qualities. He was not practiced at this. He had said what he needed to say to Ruth 23 years ago in different circumstances, and the years between then and now had not given him much occasion to practice the kind of speech that required careful ordering of words. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "The ranch is not a grand operation," he said. "It's comfortable and it's mine, and I've run it well. I have a house that has too many rooms for one person and a kitchen that I'm honest enough to admit is underused." He paused. "I'm 51 years old. I'm not proposing anything that wouldn't be proper in every way." He looked at her. "But I'd like to ask whether you'd consider marrying me, and before you answer, I want to be plain about why I'm asking." "Go ahead," she said. "Because you're the clearest-headed person I've spent time with in 30 years of knowing people," he said. "Because when you said you were very good at the teaching, that was the first time in months I'd heard someone say a true thing about themselves without dressing it up or apologizing for it. And because—" He stopped, looked at the table, looked back at her. "Because I've been coming in on Fridays for 9 years, and this is the first winter I've come home from supper and noticed that the house was quiet." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "There are things that take time to say because the person saying them has to work out how to say them. And there are things that take time because the person hearing them has to work out what they mean. And there are things that take time for no reason except that some moments are large enough to require a moment." "What would I do on the ranch?" she said. He blinked. This was not the first question he had anticipated. "What would you want to do?" "I'd want to teach," she said. "Harlan's Bend has 30 children of school age and no teacher since old Mr. Paris left in September. I've been thinking about it since November." She looked at him steadily. "If I'm going to make my life in this place, it needs to be a life that includes the work I'm good at. I'm not going to be useful on livestock." "The school board would listen to me," he said. "I've been here 20 years. I know every man on it." "I'd want to do the talking myself," she said. "Of course," he said. "I'd just make sure they were listening before you started." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, I'll marry you," she said with the directness she brought to everything. "I think we've been doing a reasonable version of figuring each other out for 4 months, and I don't see any reason to argue with what that's told me." He almost smiled. Not the small, controlled version, but the actual one, which changed his whole face into something younger. Mabel Gentry made a supper that night that nobody had asked for, and everyone at the table understood the reason for. The school board listened. 2 of the 5 members needed persuading, and James had a quiet word with both of them in the week before the meeting. Not a threat and not a pressure, just the plain account of what he knew and what he thought and who he was vouching for. When Nora came to that meeting and answered their questions with the specific calm of someone who has nothing to prove and considerable evidence on her side, the 2 men who had needed persuading found that they had been sufficiently persuaded. She started in September. 29 students the first year, 34 the second, because parents in the surrounding ranches started making the longer journey when they heard from the ones who were already sending children that it was worth it. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The particular skill she had was recognizing what each child needed from her, and it was different for each one, which was the part that could not be taught, and which made the difference between a teacher and a person who stands at the front of a room. She grew a kitchen garden at the ranch that was better than any garden in the county, mostly because she applied to the soil the same quality of attention she applied to everything. Careful, consistent, unglamorous, effective. She sent James to supper each evening with the specific satisfaction of someone doing work that accumulates visibly. James worked the cattle and the land and came in at the end of the day to a house that was not quiet anymore, and he found this to be one of those things that turns out to be larger than you had remembered it could be. The particular sound of someone else moving through the same rooms, the particular weight of another person knowing where you are. On the evening of their 5th anniversary, a clear October evening with the sky gone to that specific color that does not have a name, they were sitting on the porch in the way they did when the days were still warm enough for it. "I want to ask you something," Nora said. "Ask," he said. "Are you glad," she said, looking at the hills, "that you stayed late that Thursday in December?" He looked at her. 33 years old now, the hard line between her brows a little more settled, the crookedness of the left arm that she had long since stopped noticing or explaining, the same directness in the eyes. "Every day," he said, "every single day." She nodded, the nod of someone confirming what they had already believed, but that is still good to hear said plainly. She went inside to start supper. James Aldridge sat on the porch in the October evening and looked at the hills and thought about a Thursday in December. A woman in a chair by a window going nowhere in particular, with a crooked arm and a straight spine, and no one in the world who was expecting her anywhere. He had stayed for supper on a Friday. He had stayed for winter on a Thursday. He had stayed for the rest of it because there are some people you meet and you understand, slowly and then all at once, that the staying is the point. She was not the person anyone in Harlan's Bend would have chosen for him if choosing had been done by committee. Too sharp, some said, too settled in her own opinions, not soft enough. They were not wrong about what she was. They were wrong about what he needed. He had figured that out himself in a kitchen doorway on a Saturday in April, which was, as it happened, exactly when he was supposed to. "I keep thinking about the chair by the window." Not the proposal, not the school board, not the October that unmade 4 years of Nora's work in a single meeting. "I keep thinking about a woman sitting in a chair by a boarding house window with nowhere specific to go, and a man who noticed that she'd been there all morning and brought her coffee anyway, without making a thing of it. That's where it started, not with a grand gesture, with coffee, with paying attention. I've come to believe that most of the meaningful things in a life start that way, in the small, undramatic moments that nobody writes down because they don't look like much from the outside. Nora didn't collapse when the school board let her go. She didn't perform her grief for anyone. She took stock of what she had, made a plan with what was available, and got on a stage to a town she'd never heard of. That kind of steadiness, the refusal to let a bad outcome become a permanent identity, that's not luck. That's something a person builds in themselves over a long time, usually without realizing they're building it. James had built something similar in his own way. 9 years alone on a ranch after losing Ruth and their son. 9 years of showing up to the work because the work was what he had. He didn't harden into bitterness, which would have been the easier thing. He stayed open in the way that quiet people sometimes do, not loudly, not with declarations, just by continuing to notice things. The coffee, the empty cup, the woman who brought it without ceremony. What I find myself returning to is the way both of them told the truth. Nora said she was very good at the teaching, not good, very good. She didn't soften it, didn't apologize for it, didn't dress it up as humility. James heard that and understood something important. Here was a person who had looked honestly at herself and reported accurately. That's rarer than it sounds. Most of us either undersell what we're capable of because we're afraid of being wrong, or we oversell it because we're afraid of being overlooked. Nora did neither. She just said the true thing. And James, when he stood in that kitchen doorway on a Saturday in April, said the true thing too. Not a rehearsed speech, not the version designed to impress. The honest summary. This is what I have, this is what I've noticed, this is what I want and why. He was not a man who had practiced that kind of speech. He gave it anyway, because she was the kind of person who deserved the unpolished version. What happened between them wasn't magic. It was the natural result of two people who had integrity showing up in the same place long enough to see it in each other. Nora didn't stop being who she was to fit a narrower version of herself. She walked into that school board meeting and answered their questions on her own terms. James didn't try to fix what had been done to her. He just made sure the right people were listening before she spoke. I think about the students in that schoolroom. 34 of them the second year, because word got out that something worth having was happening there. They were learning their letters and their arithmetic, Yes. But they were also watching a woman who had been told she was not enough stand at the front of a room every morning and prove, quietly and without fanfare, that the people who said that were wrong. That's the thing about doing good work honestly and consistently. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates the way snow accumulates, the way the kitchen garden grew until it was the best in the county. Until one day someone looks up and sees what's been building all along. I don't think James found Nora. I think they found what they'd each been building toward, separately, without knowing the other existed, and recognized it when they finally saw it across a supper table in a Montana winter. That seems like enough. That seems actually like everything.